want to start my contribution to this discussion by going back to the question of what do we mean by class, because it's clear from all of the discussion that we've had today that class is something that absolutely shapes our lives, our prospects, our future, how long we live, how we die. All of these things are shaped by class, and yet it's one of the areas that I think is discussed in academia, in the media, in popular discussion, in one of the most superficial terms. So I think it's worth us going back to think, what is it that we actually mean? And I want to argue that Marxism and classical Marxism still offers today the best way for us to understand what class means, and also how we can start to unlock some of the problems that we've been discussing this morning, where we can find the agency to start to unlock some of the problems of how we overthrow capitalism and how we start to solve some of those contradictions. You see, for Marxists, class is a relationship, a social relationship, based on exploitation. And the great Marxist historian G.M. de Stecquois put it the following way. He said, class, essentially a relationship, is the collective social expression of the fact of exploitation, the way in which exploitation is embodied in a social structure. So for Marxists, class is not subjective. It's not about how you feel. It's not about how you speak. It's not about any of this. It might explain some of these things. It might, but it's not based on these things. It's not about where you live in the country. It's not about your lifestyle. And it's not an individual trait. It's not something that you own on your own. It is a collective and social relationship to the way in which the economy is structured. And therefore it's a collective relationship, and it's about our relationship to economic production. And because it's based on exploitation, because it's based on the extraction of surplus value from the workers by the capitalists, it's an antagonistic relationship. It's a relationship which has conflict built into it from the very beginning. So forget whatever you may have been told about classes, a series of stratifications, it's based on status or lifestyle, all the rest of it. We're talking about a social relationship based on exploitation. And on this basis, Marx saw capitalism as it was beginning to develop in his time, and as it has developed from his time to ours, if you like, as spreading everywhere that capitalism spread, spreading the predominance of the two major classes, the ruling class or the bourgeoisie, who own and control collectively the means of production, the means of making wealth in society, and the working class, the proletariat, the majority class in society today, who neither own nor control the means of production and who are forced to sell our ability to work for the capitalists in order to survive. And I'm sorry if I'm telling people things that they already know about the basis of Marxism, but it's worth people remembering that this is contested territory. And actually, apart from a small number of people in the classical Marxist tradition, the majority of people commentating on class today do not accept this. And it's an important category because we're going to come on to talk about how the working class has changed and how it's restructured and what it's changed. And what I want to explain is that the fundamentals that I've just laid out about how people survive by going to work, by creating profit for somebody else, is what shapes the fact that we're part of the working class. Not whether they're temporary workers, not whether they're permanent workers, not whether they work full-time or whether they work part-time, not whether they work down a mine or whether they work in a university. But this fundamental relationship to the economy is what defines our basis of what makes class. Now this, of course, gives us a general framework. That in itself is not a substitute for trying to understand what is happening, how class is changing, reshaping, and measuring what the balance of forces are, objectively and subjectively, between our side and the ruling class. So I want to move on. And what I want to deal with really in the remainder of the time that I have is I want to pick up on three arguments that are three of the key arguments I think historically are thrown out to try and knock down a Marxist interpretation of what class means and how it applies to the world today. The first one, I think, is the argument that the working class has shrunk or has changed beyond recognition and is no longer relevant. The second one is that workers have been rendered powerless by structural changes. In particular, at the moment, we're told that globalisation and neoliberalism have so far transferred the balance of power from workers to capital that workers no longer have any power, and our analysis is therefore irrelevant. And thirdly, I want to deal with some of the things that were mentioned by Kevin. Actually, Kevin's covered all of these areas to some degree, and I'm going to hopefully develop some of the things along my own lines of analysis. But the third thing I want to take up is the question of whether there are sections of the better working class that have been bought off by either material or immaterial privileges. And none of these arguments are new. As Kevin before me has spelt out, you can trace them right back to the 60s. They recur and they reoccur in different times, and as class struggle goes up and down, you notice a little pattern that when struggle goes down, everybody says it's all over, and then struggle comes back up and makes them look very foolish, and this happens a whole series of times in history. But they're important arguments, firstly because they now form, I think, much of the common sense of the left, not just of left academics, but of large sections of the trade union bureaucracy who put very pessimistic arguments about the power of workers in a globalised economy. And also they're very important because for us they deal with the question of agency, don't they? How you understand the composition and the power and the potential power of the working class leads you to the question of who is the agency that is able to challenge capitalism. So firstly, has the working class shrunk? I'm going to primarily look at the questions as they apply to the developed OECD nations. Now, there is a whole other discussion to be had about what is occurring in the global south, and maybe this is something we can pick up on in the discussion. Certainly nobody would argue that the working class is shrinking. Well, I hope nobody would argue the working class is shrinking in the global south, as we've seen the spread of capitalist relations across the global south and the increase of manufacturing in many countries there. In Britain and the rest of the developed nations, the argument that the working class has shrunk is based on a very narrow definition of what working class is. It is based on those stereotypes of working class people are people who work in factories, in mines, and a moment of the history of working class has been taken as a truism to explain what it is to be working class. Now, it is true that manufacturing has declined. This isn't going to come as a shock to anybody that we're going to accept this fact here today. There are smaller numbers of people today in Britain by quite a significant amount working in manufacturing than there were, say, in the 60s or in the 70s. That is true, that decline. We shouldn't overstate that decline. Manufacturing is still a significant part of the British economy, but it has declined. Interestingly, one of the reasons that numbers involved in manufacturing has declined is related to some of the things that came out in the previous section about the increased productivity of workers as capitalism ages and modernises, so that actually to maintain levels of production, less workers are required because of the changes in production techniques. So although production has declined, manufacturing production has declined in Britain, it's still the case that manufacturing output in Britain actually reached its peak in 2007. And what you find is that actually because of some of these transformations that have taken place, because less workers can still maintain or even increase the level of production because of new production techniques, in some ways those workers actually become more powerful than previous workers because a smaller number of workers can have a bigger impact on a larger amount of the economy through the action that they take. A couple of other things about the working class and the role of manufacturing, because you see the argument goes that manufacturing has gone, the old working class has gone, and it's been replaced by the service sector. People say this in terribly derogatory ways of which service sector apparently isn't real work, which, I can tell you working 12-hour shifts 3-4 times a week, it certainly feels like real work. But as the speaker in the last session said, the idea of a service sector is a pretty incoherent way to understand the world of work. And as he explained in the last session, it covers everything, doesn't it? It covers people who work in the welfare state, who are absolutely part of a modern capitalist economy and are absolutely part of the reproduction of the labour force. I don't mean having babies, I mean reproduction in terms of training, education, healthcare that is required to produce a skilled workforce that the capitalists need. But it also covers lots of things that are thought of as old manual traditional working class jobs: transport, the postal service, porters in hospitals. It covers people who work in hotels and catering. It covers all sorts of different... It's not a very useful category of analysis. The other section that people talk about in terms of the way in which the working class is restructured is a shift towards white-collar workers, which is absolutely true, that there has been a huge growth in white-collar workers over the past decades, both in the private and in the public sector, and even manufacturing actually increasingly needs white-collar workers in order to do their job. and in order to maintain production and productivity. And it used to be that white-collar workers were a minority in the workforce. And that's not the case, I don't think, anymore in places like Britain. And I think one of the transformations that you see over the past couple of decades that's very interesting if you think about where we stand politically today is the way in which sections such as the public sector have very much moved to the core of the working class and of organised workers in Britain today. And we can come back to this in a little while. And partly that's to do with some of the things that Kevin has talked about in terms of the way in which the attacks have moved from the private sector to the public sector, and part of it is to do, I think, also with the importance of the public sector and the way in which public sector work has changed in terms of the way management have tried to smash terms and conditions and introduced more privatisation into the public sector and a whole number of other attacks on the way in which we work in the public sector. At the same time, as we've seen a decline in manufacturing and the shift to white-collar workers, it's also true that we've seen other areas of industry growing. It is the case in Britain today that supermarkets are now the second largest industry. People will be well aware that call centres are now a growing industry, something that people call the satanic mills of the 21st century in terms of the way in which they crowd people into quite horrible conditions. But it's not true today that workers are dissipated, are atomised. People talk about the loss of the car plants, the loss of the mines, and all of those things, which are absolutely true. Many large workplaces and the communities that surrounded them have been decimated. But in Britain today, the majority of people still work in workplaces of more than 50 employees. And there are a whole number of workplaces now where the numbers are much, much greater. You think of sections of the public sector in universities, in hospitals, or you think about, the Heathrow Airport is one of the biggest employers in London. There are workplaces that bring together huge amounts of people. It's not true that the working class is atomised and split into tiny little places. Now, along with the idea that we've seen the decline in manufacturing, I think adds to the common sense of this idea that we've heard about, that Kevin has touched on himself, about the idea of insecurity and the rise in precarious work, something obviously that I'm assuming that Guy is going to go on to talk about, as he's written the key text on this question in his book, the key modern text on this question in the Precariat. And I agree very much with the thrust of what Kevin has said before me about how many of the structural changes in work are exaggerated, and that we shouldn't exaggerate the way in which work has transformed for most people. It is still the case, even with all the things that we know are true about the use of agency work, the rising unemployment, all the rest of it, it's still true that the majority of people who are in work are in permanent work. It's also true the majority of people are in permanent full-time work, although I agree as well that part-time work is not necessarily insecure work and has added actually to some of the security and the growth of permanent jobs in the economy. So we shouldn't exaggerate the trend to which precarious working has become the norm, and we shouldn't just accept this as being the case. Now, and it's also true that as work has restructuralised and new industries have grown, we should neither accept that these places are precarious workplaces. And just because somewhere is ununionised or has less unionised traditions, such as in supermarkets or call centres, does not in itself make these precarious workplaces or make these places in which insecure work is the norm. In fact, I was looking at a study a few weeks ago which looked at call centres in Britain and found that the majority of people working in call centres in Britain have been working there for over 3 years, some of them longer, obviously some of them a bit less long. Now, none of this, I think, means that we should be complacent. It is true that we face real challenges at work, and anybody who works somewhere where there is a mixture of permanent contracts and temporary contracts, or where agency workers, even in a very small number, have been introduced into their workforce, will know that this throws up real challenges about how you organise, and will know also, reflecting some of what Kevin said earlier, how that this is used to increase the threat of insecurity in your job, and whether that insecurity is real or imagined, it has real effects on how people feel about their workplace, that people feel the threat of unemployment, of privatisation, of their replacement by casuals, their replacement by agency workers. And so I think we have to say the fear outstrips the reality, but that doesn't mean that we don't have any real issues to grapple with in terms of how we organise people in ununionised work, how we organise people who are in agency work, and how we bring those people into the core of the organised workforce. Now, we face challenges is true, but none of this is to say that I accept the premise, which hopefully Guy will go on to explain, and that people can read about in his book, the premise that the precariat in some way represents a new class of workers. As far as I can see, the precariat represents a section of the working class. Often people will move in and out. At some point in your life, you may have a full-time, temporary, or a permanent job. At some time, you may have a temporary job. It's not true that these things are separate. And it's also not true that any of these battles that we face today are new. None of them create a justification for saying that we have a new class of workers. Take casualisation, for example. Casualisation has actually been the norm for a lot of employment under capitalism over the last, since its inception actually. And you take somewhere like the docks, where over the last 100 years there's been struggles that have gone forwards and backwards over the question of whether or not people have casualised contracts or full-time contracts. It's something that goes forwards and something that goes backwards. Those battles are not new, and neither is the restructuring of the working class. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that's thrown at Marxists often is that we're the people who say that nothing ever changes. That's not the Marxist position. The Marxist position is that everything always changes. And our understanding of the working class is that it's constantly restructuring. Because I talked about exploitation at the beginning as being one of the key defining features, one of the key defining divides of capitalism. The other key defining divide of capitalism is the divide of competition, and that competition leads to the constant restructuring of capital and the search for new industries, new ways to make money. And that means that the working class is always restructured. In the 1830s and 40s, the biggest concentration of the working class in places like Britain was in textiles, was mill workers. That was then replaced 40 years later by the growth in mines and heavy industry, things like shipbuilding. By the Second World War, that had changed again, so you have an expansion in the car industry, electrical goods, light manufacturing. And the interesting thing is that every shift and restructuring has been accompanied by the sorts of arguments that I talked about at the beginning. The idea that the working class is no longer relevant, the idea that there is either a new privileged class or a new underclass that is no longer part of the working class and no longer organisable in the same way. And every time people have regretted with some form of nostalgia what the old working class used to be. I was even reading something from the 1870s where a former Chartist was lamenting the fact that the working class wasn't what it used to be. It's no longer wearing the rags and arguing earnestly about social issues, but now wandering around well-dressed and wandering around with greyhounds covered in cloth and a length of string. So, that was their complaint then. Today, people complain that there aren't enough workers wandering around with greyhounds on a piece of string. So you can't have it both ways, can you? But as Kevin pointed out, there's a whole body of work that has tried to theorise the disappearance of the working class, and I think we have to locate the ideas that there is a new class called the Precariat into this realm of work. Now I'm just going to move on very quickly. Second argument, which I'm going to do much more briefly, has neoliberalism and globalisation, have they rendered workers powerless? Now, there's a whole body of work arguing this as well, and we don't have well, I don't have time for a full debate on neoliberalism. If that's what you choose to do with your time, then that's absolutely fine. And I think we just have to remember that there are a whole number of myths about neoliberalism and globalisation, and we've touched on many of them today, so I won't go into them in detail. But it is true that the perceived threat that globalisation offers us way outstrips the reality, that capital is not footloose and fancy-free, that most corporations are heavily intertwined with the domestic states of the areas in which they live, because capital needs the state needs the capital, as we talked about in the previous session. And the threat of relocation of factories, we're going to move abroad if you don't accept a pay cut, a job cut, a change in your working conditions, often largely outweighs the possibilities of them actually doing that. There are some things that it's easy to relocate internationally, and finance being one of those. There are other things that can't be relocated because they're service sector things that relate to people here. You can't, relocate the whole of the postal service for London to Bangkok or something, because how would you get it through the letterboxes? It would be difficult. There are a whole number of other things that can't be relocated abroad. And also it's true that corporations rely not just on being able to find cheap labour, but being able to find stable labour, educated labour, a state that's willing to provide infrastructure for them to do that. And it quite often means that although they try and use competition between different countries or even different towns within the same country, when you look at what some of the corporations do to try and discipline their workforce, the threat is greater than the reality. And capital is not all-powerful. It has met resistance everywhere that it's been, and you only think about the last few decades, from Latin America to the Arab Spring, where the Arab Spring was not a protest just about a dictatorship and about democracy. It was also a protest and revolution over the impact of neoliberalism, over the question of food prices, over a whole number of economic issues. It was a protest against capital as well as against dictatorship. Or you think about the anti-austerity protests, the strikes, the general strikes, November the 30th in Britain. There are a whole number of other things that we can do here. And everywhere that capital has relocated, it's found that it's taken resistance with it. And this is one of the things that they found in the car industry, that everywhere the car industry has gone, that it's thought, we'll go to South Korea because, you know, car workers have been a bit militant in Britain, let's go to South Korea, it'll be quiet there. South Korea, you may have noticed, has an amazing history of militancy in the car plants. It's like militancy in Britain in the 70s, but with much longer batons and flags and sticks and things. So everywhere they go, they find there is resistance. My final point in this argument is about the third point, about is there a privileged section of workers? Because I think one of the most pernicious arguments about saying that there is a new precariat, a new class of people on the fringes of society who are more insecure than everybody else, is that they're pitched in opposition to the core of the working class, the people who supposedly have permanent jobs, good conditions, pensions, a job for life and all the rest of it. Now, much of what that depends on is a lie anyway, and you know, it's not just Guy and people who argue the Precariat who say this. I don't know if people saw Zizek's latest article in the London Review of Books, where Zizek argues that the anti-capitalist protests, strikes and student protests that we've seen in recent years are all best understood as the revolt of what he calls the salaried bourgeoisie. In other words, they're the attempts by people who are privileged in the workforce to protect themselves against descending into becoming proletarian. And he writes, who dares strike today when having a permanent job is itself a privilege? Not low-paid workers, but privileged workers who have guaranteed jobs. And the examples that he gives are teachers, public transport workers and police. Now, let's leave aside the whole question of are the police part of the working class, because we're going to go down and open a whole other can of worms there. But the idea that teachers and public transport workers are part of a privileged elite in the working class is a joke, isn't it? In actual fact, if you look at the number of people who earn less than £7 an hour in Britain, more than 20% of those people work in the public sector. It's an absolute myth that the public sector is this bloated, privileged section, and it echoes the worst arguments of the Tories about our gold-plated pensions, about our privileged position and all the rest of it. It's absolutely not true. And I've been told to hurry, so I'm going to hurry. I'm going to talk faster and faster, you'll see, until I get to the end of my notes. My final point, really, then, is that all of these things that I've talked about matter, and they matter because of the question that I mentioned at the beginning, the question of agency, the question of does power still lie with working class people to challenge the logic of capital and to destroy the logic of capital once and for all. And it means we have to understand two things. Firstly, we have to understand the objective reality of class. That class today, globally as well as locally, the working class constitutes the vast majority of people and objectively has an interest in ending the way in which capitalism perpetuates our exploitation and survives off absolutely survives off our exploitation. The second thing we have to consider is the subjective question of whether our class feels an awareness of that power. And this is what Marx talked about when he talked about how we go from being a class, the working class goes from being a class in itself to a class for itself. So objectively, the restructuring of the working class is nothing like as frightening as it might seem, but all those subjective questions about how people feel, how they feel insecure, how they overcome that feeling of insecurity, about how they understand their position, are absolutely key questions. And that's why the question of struggle comes back all the time. And often when you're a Marxist, people ask, why do you go on about strikes all the time? And, you know, I wasn't on strike this week, but other health workers were, and I took a card round to collect for them. And people often say to me, why are you so interested in strikes all the time? Because strikes are one of the ways in which people learn about their own power and their own ability to resist. It's something that breaks down the divisions. And I think we face many challenges, and one of the main challenges that we face is to continue the battle over public sector pensions in Britain and to try and widen that battle. And I think one of the brilliant things about November the 30th last year was that it was broad enough and wide enough that it did pull in other sections of the workforce. Certainly in the NHS where I work, it did pull in people who are on temporary contracts, people who are on agency work, people who've been outsourced, who joined picket lines because they felt the confidence of being part of a bigger, stronger majority of people. And that means for me that struggle will erupt in all sorts of different ways, from all the things we've talked about the intransigent problems that the ruling class face and the squeezing of our living standards. We know that there will be eruptions and there will be explosions. Some of these will take the form of obvious class struggle, and some of them will be the cry, if you like, of the dispossessed, the riots, the protests and all the rest of it. But for revolutionary Marxists, the strategic question is still, where does the power lie to link all those explosions to a strategic question of where does power lie to bring capitalism to an end? And that lies with the organised working class. I think our position should be that we're not saying that nothing has changed, and we're not saying that there is nothing ever new in the way in which work is structured. I think the point that we should be making, though, is that we have no interest in exaggerating the shape, the form or the extent of the ways they do. Because, you see, the ruling class do have an interest in exaggerating the insecurity of our job tenure, the temporariness of our contracts, the footloose nature of globalisation. You can see the interest that they have in doing that. I don't see the interest that our side have in doing that. Having said that, there are changes. Globalisation is a real phenomenon. It is true that capitalism is a more global system today than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. That doesn't mean that capital has become all-powerful, and that doesn't mean also that the state is no longer relevant. In fact, some ways, I think that globalisation creates for us a very positive phenomenon, doesn't it? It creates a global working class. It means that the working class is now located everywhere in the world and is now genuinely a majority of the world population, that there is now nowhere in the world in which workers do not exist and are not part of the global working class. It's also not, we're not saying that nothing has changed in the nature of work. We have faced enormous attacks at work over the past few decades. We talked in the last session about how profit levels have been maintained by an increase in exploitation of working class people, the longer hours that people work, the unpaid overtime that is increasing that people do, and also the restructuring of work, particularly in the public sector, that means people are increasingly working on, basically on a production line method of work, the increasing target-driven, people will talk about whether they're in academia, in teaching, in health work, all the rest of it. Your person that you're supposed to be providing a service for is a client or a customer, and you have to have an outcome that's measurable at the other end, and all the rest of this sort of thing that is an attempt to make people work harder for less and for longer. So restructuring has occurred in those terms. That, however, does not mean that we have a new fragmented class system. If anything, the changes that I've talked about, the globalisation and the way in which work has been restructured in major parts of the economy, have made a class that is easier to unite and not harder to unite. Now, of course, it's true that some people work in more precarious jobs than others, and this comrade at the front says, how can Mr. Reasonable says, how could anyone possibly disagree with the idea that there is a precariat? Now, of course, there are more precarious jobs. There are areas that it's a more horrendous place to work than others. There are places where you're more likely to get the sack more easily, where you're likely to be monitored more consistently, where you're going to be on a shorter-term contract and you're going to be bullied more easily. There are worse places to work and more precarious places to work than other places that have defended their position. And it's true that there have been a whole number of campaigns across Europe and elsewhere to try and drive back the attempts to make our lives more and more insecure. The labour laws that make it easier to sack people has been an explosive point in France, for example. There have been lots of campaigns, and we should support those campaigns, and we should support union drives in places where people are not unionised. But to slide from saying we want to stop the encroachment of more insecure ways of working into the rest of the workforce, to slide from that into saying we accept that there is a separate group of people known as the Precariat, is a very dangerous route to take, and a completely unnecessary route to take when we're talking about a situation in which the global working class is bigger than it was in Marx's day and shares more and more the same characteristics of the way in which work is organised as a whole. And I think you can see by any of the struggles that people talk about, and this is the same in Britain as the argument that we've had about informal workers in the global south, that where workers move as a whole, they can pull many other groups behind them, whether it's the students, the unemployed, the informal workers, the people on temporary contracts. And that doesn't take away from the idea that there is a strategic point to saying that organised workers are at the heart of a strategy for change. You see, I think there are two mistakes that the labour movement can make in terms of people in precariat work. The first one is that they can say that these people are unorganisable, and there are sections of the trade union leadership who have previously said that people who are in low pay, part-time contracts, who are under agency work cannot be organised. The flip side of that mistake is to say that these are the only people worth organising, and that's to write off the big bulk of the working class who are organised. And I think we have to say we are working class because we have a collective social relationship with the way in which profit is extracted from us. And whether you do that through a temporary contract or a permanent contract, whether you do that through part-time work or full-time work, your relationship is the same, and you are part of the working class, which means you have a shared interest in overthrowing and destroying a system that wants to bring us down. Now, insecurity is a real question in this, because insecurity is one of the things that makes people frightened to resist. And I remember reading one of the key moments from the Arab revolutions, and somebody who was there explained it as being the moment that fear changed sides. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. The ruling class want to divide us all against each other. They want to divide the private sector against the public sector. There are sections on the left who would then replicate this by trying to pit supposedly privileged workers against unprivileged workers. We have to fight for the unity of the class as a whole. And we have to fight for the moment when the fear changes side. And that's why the big bulk of organised workers are so key to giving the confidence that the fear can change side from our side to the ruling class.